in the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning fog still clings to valleys untouched by time, lies a mystery that has unsettled historians for nearly 200 years. The year was 1834, when Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, reached the secluded Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow. This community was so remote that most maps of the period didn't even mark its presence. What occurred during their brief 3-day stay was carefully preserved in the private writings of Pastor William Phillips. His journal, rediscovered in 1987 after the church was torn down, contains entries so detailed and uncanny that modern researchers have pored over them ever since. Psychologists, historians, and even skeptics have all tried to make sense of it, yet the mystery remains. The Morrison twins, only 9 years old at the time, did not simply make predictions. They spoke truths about events long past, revealed hidden family secrets, and described tragedies that had happened before their birth, each claim later proven to be entirely accurate. The case forces us to confront an unsettling question: can the human mind access knowledge in ways science still cannot explain? Kentucky in the early 1800s was a land balanced between wilderness and civilization. Settlements like Pine Hollow lived in near isolation, in the shadow of the Cumberland foothills. Founded in 1818 by a few families fleeing denominational conflict, the community never grew beyond 200 people, bound tightly by kinship and Baptist tradition. Their lives revolved around a humble wooden church built from the surrounding forest. Its leader, Pastor William Phillips, was not only their preacher but also their record keeper. His journals were the sole written history of births, deaths, and notable happenings, and would become the foundation of this chilling account. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar presence among mountain congregations. At just 34, his weathered face and gray-streaked hair revealed years of hardship. Widowed since his wife Sarah's death during the twins' birth, he carried little more than a Bible, a few belongings, and his own journal of spiritual reflections. Rebecca and Rachel, identical in appearance but opposite in temperament, always accompanied him. Rebecca was lively, cheerful, and quick to win affection. Rachel was quiet, observant, and strangely attuned to her sister, often completing Rebecca's thoughts before she spoke. While many credited Ezekiel's fiery sermons for renewing struggling churches, others whispered that the true influence came from the girls themselves. Revivals, reconciliations, and sudden awakenings often followed after private talks with the twins. Their journey to Pine Hollow had been grueling. Autumn rains turned the trails into rivers of mud, and Rachel fell ill with fever, forcing Ezekiel to carry her for the last stretch. They arrived at dusk on November 15th, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips was finishing evening prayer with a few faithful members. Phillips later described his first impression of the family as one of anxiety and spiritual. Ezekiel's clothing was worn thin. The girls clung tightly to his side, and yet there was a piercing awareness in their eyes that made him uneasy. That night, while sharing supper with the Phillips family, something occurred that Pastor Phillips immediately recorded. Rebecca turned to the pastor's wife and asked about the roses by the east fence, specifically whether they had recovered from the blight that nearly killed them 3 summers earlier. Stunned, Mrs. Phillips confirmed the truth. No outsider could have known about the disease that struck her prized garden years before. When asked how she knew, Rebecca only smiled and claimed she had dreamed of roses on their journey, and somehow felt they belonged to Mrs. Phillips. This was only the beginning. In the following days, the girls would speak and act in ways that defied every explanation the community had. Pastor Phillips' journal captures it all. Word for word, the morning after their arrival dawned gray and bitter with the wind rattling the small cabin's shutters. Pastor Phillips rose early, as he always did, unaware that what awaited him would challenge not only his faith, but his understanding of reality itself. Phillips found Ezekiel already awake, seated by the faint glow of dying embers. The preacher's Bible lay open on his lap, though his gaze was fixed far beyond its pages, clouded with unease. The girls were restless last night, Ezekiel admitted when Phillips asked about his troubled look. They often dream of places we're bound for, but these were different, heavier, darker. Before Phillips could answer, Rebecca appeared at the doorway. Her hair was tangled from sleep, yet her eyes were sharp and intent. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear child's voice, "in your church, beneath the 3rd floorboard, by the altar, something is hidden. Rachel dreamed of it, and I dreamed of why it was placed there." A cold wave passed through the pastor. No one knew about that place. 3 months earlier, in a moment of weakness, he had hidden a bottle of whiskey under those very boards. He had wrapped it in a scrap of blue baby's blanket, a keepsake of the son he and his wife had lost years before. To him, the secret bottle was both temptation and punishment, a symbol of his failings as father and shepherd. "What exactly did you see in your dream?" Phillips asked, trying to steady his voice. Rachel slipped into the room, silent as ever. "The bottle is brown," she whispered, wrapped in a baby's blue blanket. The pastor's strength seemed to drain from him. Every detail was true. Ezekiel gave him a look that carried both sympathy and weariness. "It began when they were very young," he said quietly. "At first, I thought it was just children's intuition, but as the years passed, their knowing became too precise to explain. That Sunday's service would never be forgotten in Pine Hollow. Ezekiel's sermon was fiery, but familiar, a call for confession and renewal. Yet what followed stunned every soul in the little church. As the congregation prepared to leave, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, one of the wealthiest farmers in the valley. She gazed up at him with innocent blue eyes and said, "Mr. Turner, if someone borrows from God's money and plans to return it, is it really stealing? Papa says God forgives those who repent." Turner went pale. For half a year he had been skimming from the offering plate to pay off debts, promising himself he would restore it later. No one was supposed to know. Then Rachel stepped forward. her gaze fixed on Martha Whitfield, the stern widow who held great moral sway in the community. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said softly, "your husband didn't die in an accident, did he? He's still alive. That's why you keep his letters." The old woman swayed on her feet. It was true. Her husband had abandoned her and the children long ago, running off west with their savings. She had invented the story of his death to protect her children's standing, hiding his occasional letters of regret. The twins did not stop there. They spoke to Dr. Hayes of patients who had died from his poor medical skill. To the Millers, they mentioned the son hidden in their attic, whose simple mind brought them shame. To young Thomas Brett, they revealed his secret meetings with a married woman while her husband was away. Each word was spoken plainly, without cruelty or scorn, yet each cut deep secrets no child should have known, secrets known only to God, Pastor. Phillips watched in frozen dread as his congregation unraveled under the children's voices. But the most terrible revelation came last. Rebecca walked to the altar, laid her small hand on the wooden cross carved by the founding families, and said, "This is holy ground." But it was stained long before today. The Whitman family did not perish in a fire at their home, did they, Pastor? They died here, in this very room. And some of you know why. The church fell into absolute silence. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Phillips gripped the pulpit, his face drained of color. The Whitmans were the settlement's deepest wound, a secret buried for 16 years. Jacob Whitman, the blacksmith, and his wife Mary, the healer, had been pillars of Pine Hollow. Their twin daughters, Faith and Hope, only 9, had been the community's pride. The story everyone knew, that they had perished in a house fire, was a lie, and now the truth was demanding to be heard. The official account, preserved in the carefully kept records of Pastor Phillips's predecessors, told of a tragedy. It claimed the Whitman family had been lost in a house fire during a brutal winter storm. Their remains, recovered from the ashes, were laid to rest in the churchyard with the proper rites. The settlement mourned, rebuilt, and moved on, as frontier communities always had to when misfortune struck. But Rebecca's words suggested something entirely different, something that some of the oldest families had prayed would never surface. Again, Elder Thompson, 73 years old, and among the earliest founders of Pine Hollow, slowly rose from his seat. His joints protested every movement, but his voice was still strong when he finally spoke. "Child," he said carefully, "you speak of matters from before your birth, in places you have never seen. How could you possibly know what you claim?" Rebecca met his gaze, her blue eyes unsettlingly steady. Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder, she whispered. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith carried a little wooden doll her father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. On the night they died, Faith wore her blue Sunday dress. Hope, still feverish, was in her nightgown. Gasps rippled through the older members of the congregation. These were details only the dead themselves, those who had seen them, could have known. Thompson's wife gripped his arm, her face pale with fear. Rachel's soft voice followed. "It wasn't fire that killed them. That night they came here, to the church. They were hiding behind the altar, running from someone who meant them harm, but they were found. The air inside the chapel grew unnervingly still. Pastor Phillips suddenly recalled half-forgotten whispers he had overheard over the years and finished sentences that ceased when he entered. Sidelong glances between elders, and the curious habit of certain families leaving flowers at a bare patch in the graveyard. Samuel Turner, still shaken from his earlier disgrace, jumped to his feet. "Nonsense," he barked, though his voice lacked strength. "They're just frightening us with stories. This is madness." But the room would not return to silence. Memories stirred. Mrs. Carter, speaking almost to herself, mentioned the red stains that once appeared on the church floorboards, stains that no scrubbing could ever remove. Old Benjamin Forster muttered about the sound of children weeping in the church, at night sounds long dismissed as mere wind. Even Dr. Hayes, usually careful with his words, admitted quietly, "When I worked on the eastern wall a few years ago, I found fragments in the mortar. They looked like bones." The weight of his words settled over the congregation. If the Whitmans had died here, and their remains hidden within the very stones, then every prayer, every hymn, had been sung above their unmarked tomb. Through all this, Ezekiel Morrison had remained quiet, his weathered face troubled but unseen. He had seen moments like this before his daughter's visions, peeling back layers of silence and lies. At last, Pastor Phillips turned to him. "Mr. Morrison," he asked, voice strained, "how do your daughters know such things? What kind of gift is this?" Ezekiel studied the congregation before answering. "I have asked myself the same question every day. Their mother, Sarah, sometimes claimed she could sense things others could not. But what the girls see is beyond that. They dream of people they've never met, places they've never been, events from before they were born. At first I thought it a blessing, but it carries a terrible weight. They see truths that no child should bear." As if summoned, Rebecca and Rachel stepped forward together. For the first time, they looked their true age, small, fragile, worn down by burdens far too heavy for them. "We don't choose," Rebecca said, her voice tired. "The dreams come no matter what we want. We see what was, what is, and sometimes what will be." Rachel's hand tightened around her sister's. "The Whitman sisters come to us in dreams. They want the truth known. They want to be remembered for what really happened." The silence that followed was thick with fear, doubt, and hope. Some faces showed skepticism, others awe. A few dared to believe the veil between life and death might not be as final as they once thought. Pastor Phillips realized he stood at a turning point. He could dismiss the girl's words as childish imagination and protect the fragile piece of Pine Hollow, or he could chase the truth and risk unraveling everything the town had been built upon. That evening, as night spread across the little settlement, Phillips found he could not bring himself to pray. His mind was already too crowded with shadows. The revelations from the twins had unsettled Pastor Phillips more deeply than he cared to admit. It wasn't only the accuracy of their visions, but the way they forced him to face questions he had long avoided. 5 years earlier he had come, Pine Hollow, eager to serve God on the frontier, while escaping the endless theological squabbles in Kentucky's larger towns. His predecessor, Pastor Murray Hayes, had been meticulous in recording births, deaths, and important events. Yet Phillips had always been troubled by certain gaps in those early records. The winter of 1818 was especially peculiar. There were notes about brutal weather, food shortages, and the passing of several elders, but the supposed tragedy of the Whitman family was covered with startling brevity. The entry stated that Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, perished in a fire on December 21st. Their remains laid to rest with Christian rites. What Phillips had always found strange was the lack of detail. Hayes was usually precise, even about small incidents. Yet here the death of a prominent family was condensed into a few sparse lines. Now, stirred by the Morrison girls' claims, Phillips began combing through the church's old archives with fresh eyes. Hidden beneath layers of records, he uncovered a small leather-bound journal he had never seen before. Its pages were water-damaged, but the handwriting was unmistakably Hayes's by candlelight. Phillips read words that would forever change his view of Pine Hollow. Hayes had written of his unease about the Whitman deaths. Jacob Whitman, it seemed, had uncovered disturbing truths about certain townsfolk, something serious enough that he had demanded public confession and restitution. Hayes's writing hinted at financial deceit, perhaps even darker crimes. On December 20th, 1818, Jacob had confronted several community leaders in a heated meeting that stretched long past midnight. Hayes described raised voices, accusations, both threats of exposure that could ruin reputations. Then came the final entry, dated December 22nd. "The Lord forgive us all for what was done." Jacob and his family came to the church for sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silent. By morning we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Phillips looked the journal with trembling hands. The implications were horrifying. The Whitmans had not died in a house fire at all. They had been slain inside the church, their deaths covered up by the settlement's leaders. But what chilled him even more was how the Morrison twins could possibly know such hidden details, descriptions of the girls' belongings. Even their appearance knowledge, buried for 16 years. A knock at his door broke his thoughts. When he opened it, Rebecca stood outside, moonlight shining on her neatly braided hair. "Pastor Phillips," she said softly, "you found Pastor Hayes's journal, didn't you? The one he hid behind a loose stone in the foundation." Phillips's breath caught. That was indeed where he had discovered it, guided by nothing more than a draught through the wall. "How did you know?" he asked. "Faith showed me in a dream," Rebecca answered calmly. "She said Pastor Hayes was a good man forced into sin. She wanted someone to know the truth. The casual way she spoke of a message from a long-dead child sent shivers down his spine. "Rebecca," he asked carefully, "what do you actually see in these dreams?" Her face grew grave. "We see everything, not just the events, but the reasons. The men who killed the Whitmans never meant for blood to be shed. They only wanted Jacob silenced. But he discovered something." Phillips followed her gaze toward Rachel, who sat by the window, staring at the graveyard beyond the church. "Rebecca," continued, "the money for the church didn't come from offerings. Some of it was stolen from travelers who never left the valley. Jacob realized it when he was asked to forge horseshoes for animals that belonged to dead men. Pieces began locking into place. The early years of Pine Hollow had been marked by reports of travelers disappearing, always blamed on storms, wild animals, or accidents. But if Jacob had uncovered proof of deliberate murders and thefts, then the church itself had been funded by blood money. "That's why faith and hope cannot rest," Rebecca whispered. "Their blood was spilled on ground already cursed." Phillips felt a dreadful certainty. The sanctuary he had cherished was built on sin and consecrated by murder. Yet even as fear gripped him, the rational part of his mind asked, could any of this be proven? Could he distinguish truth from a child's visions? The answer came sooner than he expected. The very next morning, as the Morrisons prepared to depart, a lone rider appeared on the eastern trail, bringing with him news that would test every belief Phillips held. The rider who arrived that morning was a man in his 50s, dressed in fine clothing more fitting for the city than for the mountains. He carried himself with the confidence of someone educated and accustomed to authority. Introducing himself as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington, he explained to Pastor Phillips that he had come in search of information about Pine Hollow's earliest years. "I represent the estate of Marcus Webb," Brennan said as he accepted the pastor's offer of rest and food. "Mr. Webb passed away in Louisville not long ago. Among his belongings, we discovered papers that suggest he had financial dealings connected to this community. I am attempting to determine what became of those funds, as the records hint at some irregularities." Phillips felt a cold weight settle in his chest. That name Marcus Webb had appeared in the private notes of Pastor Hayes, his predecessor. Hayes had written about several travelers who had mysteriously vanished along the mountain paths during 1818 and 1819. One of them was Webb, who had reportedly been carrying a large sum intended for land purchases in Tennessee. Before Phillips could compose a reply, Rebecca appeared beside him with the uncanny timing that always unsettled him. Fixing her curious eyes on Brennan, she said, "Mr. Webb had a gold watch with his initials engraved inside. The glass was cracked when he dropped it from his horse." Brennan's composure faltered. "That detail was never made public," he said sharply. "Only Webb's brother knew about the cracked watch." At that moment Rachel drifted to her sister's side, her voice soft but clear. "The watch is buried behind the church," she said, "along with his money pouch and his horse's bridle. Elder Thompson hid them there after what happened on the trail." The implication struck Phillips like a hammer. If the girls were right, Evidence of murder and theft lay hidden behind the churchyard and, with it, proof that Pine Hollow's foundation rested on blood. Brennan rose with sudden urgency. "Then we must dig at once," he declared. "If these children are correct, we are uncovering murder, not just missing property." Elder Thompson, the last surviving elder of Pine Hollow's founding generation, had been listening nearby. At 73, his face was lined with the weight of years, but his voice still carried authority. "You don't know what you speak of, stranger," he said slowly. "This community was carved out of wilderness by people who did what was needed to survive. Survival is no excuse for killing." Brennan snapped back. "If this is true, the very roots of Pine Hollow are soaked in crime." Rebecca turned her piercing gaze on Thompson. "The nightmares ended after the first year, didn't they? You thought that meant God forgave you." Thompson's resolve faltered. His face crumpled as Rachel added quietly, "No one else knows." Bow the dreams. How Marcus Webb's face still begs you to let him go before sleep takes you. The old man sank onto a stump, trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "We only wanted his money. We were starving, our children sick, and winter closing in." But Webb fought back. His unfinished confession drifted into silence. Pastor Phillips felt his entire understanding of his church and town unravel. Ezekiel Morrison, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "The truth rises whether we want it or not," he said evenly. "My daughters don't choose these revelations. They are only the messengers." At Brennan's insistence, men gathered to dig where the twins had directed. Within hours, their shovels struck metal. Buried 3 feet down lay a tarnished gold watch with a cracked crystal, its inside cover engraved with the initials M.W. Nearby was a decayed leather pouch and the remnants of a horse's bridle. Brennan examined the items carefully. "This matches Marcus Webb's belongings exactly," he said firmly. "Even the damaged chain is the same." But it was Elder Thompson's reaction that confirmed everything. Staring at the unearthed relics as if they were ghosts, he finally whispered, "There were others. Webb wasn't the first or the last. That trail was perfect. Travelers passed alone, carrying money for land or trade. We did what we had to, again and again." The scope of Pine Hollow's dark origins was laid bare. The town had not been built by faith, and toil alone it had been financed by ambush and bloodshed. Yet even as the truth came to light, Pastor Phillips was haunted by a deeper question. How could the Morrison twins know these hidden, detailed secrets buried decades before their birth? The answers that emerged were more unsettling than anything Pastor Phillips could have reasoned out for himself, forcing him to wrestle with the terrifying notion that death might not be the final chapter after all. As the sun sank behind the bridges that evening, throwing long shadows across both the dig site and the weathered cemetery, he understood that Pine Hollow stood on the edge of revelation. 16 years of secrets had at last begun to unravel, carrying with them questions that tore at the very foundation of faith, morality, and reality itself. The Morrison twins lingered in the twilight, their slim silhouettes framed against the church, its walls raised with ill-gotten wealth and consecrated by spilled innocence. They tilted their heads as if listening to whispers no one else could hear, their gaze fixed on the graves where so many untold stories lay hidden. Tomorrow promised judgment, but this night belonged to the restless dead who had found a voice, through to 9-year-old children whose knowledge defied every natural explanation. When dawn broke gray and bitter, Pine Hollow found itself crowded with strangers from the county seat. Solicitor Brennan had lost no time in summoning the law, and by mid-morning a sheriff, a territorial judge, and 2 federal marshals rode into the settlement. The marshals had long been chasing rumors of missing travelers along the mountain trails, and now they hoped for answers. Judge Harrison, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, chose the church itself as his courtroom decision. Pastor Phillips could not help but find grimly fitting, given the blood already bound to those timbers. The entire village gathered as if for worship. Only now the service was one of judgment and truth. Elder Thompson, frail and visibly broken under the weight of his past, sat in the first pew, flanked by 2 other aging leaders. Their sunken eyes betrayed decades of silence too heavy to bear. Yet it was not the elders, but the Morrison twins, who drew every gaze. The judge, though skeptical of tales about ghostly visions, had spent the morning questioning the girls separately. Their knowledge of crimes committed years before their birth had left him shaken. Rebecca Morrison. His voice rang in the timbered chamber. Tell this court how you knew the location of Marcus Webb's possessions. The child stood in the witness space, appearing impossibly small under the heavy eyes of the gathering. Faith Whitman told me in a dream, she said simply. She told me the men who killed her family were the same ones who preyed on travelers. She wanted the truth to be known. And you, Rachel Morrison. The judge pressed. How do you know details from before your lifetime? Rachel's voice was faint, trembling but clear. The dreams come to both of us. We don't just see, we feel it. Their fear, their last words, their pain. Judge Harrison narrowed his eyes. So you claim to commune with the spirits of the dead? Before the girls could respond, Ezekiel Morrison rose. Your Honor, my daughters have never pretended to understand their gift. They only describe what comes to them. I've seen it with my own eyes. In towns far from Fairfax, they could not possibly know by ordinary means. Sheriff Mackenzie, a man of facts more than superstition, leaned forward. Children, can you tell us how many were slain along these trails? The twins exchanged their silent, knowing glance. Rebecca spoke first. 11 men over 3 years. Most were traveling alone, carrying money for land or trade. One was a preacher like my papa. He had gold coins sewn into his saddle. The sheriff's jaw tightened as Rachel continued seamlessly. His name was Samuel Collins. He was bound for Tennessee to build a church. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on her brow. Mackenzie drew out a tattered notebook, scanning quickly. His face went pale. Samuel Collins vanished on this route in 1819. And yes, the horse matches the record exactly. A chill spread through the congregation. Then Elder Thompson rose, shaking with age and grief. "Your Honor," his voice cracked, "the children speak truth, all of it. But there is something darker still." The church went silent, save for the wind rattling loose boards and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. The Whitmans. Thompson wept openly now. They didn't just stumble upon evidence of our deeds. Jacob Whitman was my wife's brother. I told him everything, believing blood would bind his silence. But Jacob had a conscience too strong for secrets. He threatened to report us, to demand restitution for the families we had wronged. He vowed to ride to Lexington and tell the authorities himself. Phillips felt the ground of his faith shift beneath him as Thompson's words poured out. "We couldn't allow it," the old man whispered. "Too much would be lost." On the night of December 21st, 1818, we cornered the Whitman family in this very church. Jacob thought holy ground would shield them. But we were desperate men, and we killed them. Rebecca stiffened, her face pale but unflinching. "Tell them about the babies," she said. Thompson broke completely, sobbing. "Dear God, how could you know?" Judge Harrison leaned forward. "What babies? Speak plainly, man." "Mary Whitman," Thompson gasped. "She was heavy with child. When we ended her life. Twins. She was nearly full term." The doctor's voice faltered as he tried to speak. If only help had come sooner, they might have survived. But he couldn't finish the sentence. Rachel stepped forward, her gentle voice carrying into the silence. "That's why we see things so clearly. Faith and Hope Whitman weren't the only ones lost that night. Their unborn sisters died too. 4 souls still crying for justice." Her words struck like thunder. If what she said was true, it meant the girls were somehow in touch with the spirits of the Whitman children, colluding the unborn and that challenged everything the community had been taught about the afterlife. Dr. Hayes, who had overseen the burials years before, spoke hesitantly. "I helped lay them to rest. We knew Mary Whitman had been expecting, but we convinced ourselves the babies were too young to count, too young to need proper rites." Ezekiel Morrison, the twins. "Father," broke in firmly, "every life matters to God. However short, every soul has eternal worth." Judge Harrison, however, was less concerned with theology than with justice. He turned to Elder Thompson. "Are you admitting to the deaths of Jacob and Mary Whitman, their daughters, and the unborn children?" "I am," Thompson said, hollow-voiced. "And not just them 11 travelers as well. I, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry planned it together, carried it out together, and hid it together. 16 years of silence. It's over now." The 2 other men named sat frozen, faces heavy with guilt. After all these years, the burden had finally broken them. The sheriff moved to take them into custody, but Judge Harrison lifted a hand. "Before charges, I must know how could these children possibly know secrets never spoken aloud." Rebecca's piercing blue eyes fixed on him. "Some truths cannot stay hidden. The Whitman family has been waiting 16 years to be heard. But how do you hear them? The judge pressed. Rachel joined her sister. We don't truly understand. Since we were little, we've had dreams of strangers and places unknown. Papa says our mother had second sight, but what we see is different. How so? Rebecca answered. Mama could sense what the living felt and thought. But we see echoes of the dead, especially when innocent blood is spilled. Ezekiel spoke gravely. I've sought answers for years, consulted ministers, doctors, scholars. No one can explain it, but all agree my daughter's visions prove true. The judge studied the girls, both unsettled and intrigued. If your gift is real, then tell us, where are the missing victims buried? Rebecca closed her eyes, listening. Inwardly, some lie in the old mine east of town. Others were cast into Devil's Creek, where the water runs strongest. But 3 rest beneath this very church, their bones mingled with its foundation. The congregation shuddered. Pastor Phillips's face went pale as he realized he had preached and prayed over unmarked graves for years. The sheriff turned to the judge. Shall we dig beneath the church floor? We will, Judge Harrison answered grimly. But first, I need the full truth. He looked back at Thompson. What became of the stolen money and goods? Thompson gestured weakly at the very walls around them. You see it. The church, the school, the mills all built from blood money. We told ourselves good might come from evil, that God would forgive us if we used it for his work. And by the families of the dead, the judge demanded. Did you think of them? It was Rachel who spoke, her young voice heavy with sorrows. Marcus Webb left behind a wife, Elizabeth, and 2 little boys. Samuel Collins had a fiancée. Catherine She waited for him until her death. Others had families who searched and grieved, never knowing the truth. Her uncanny knowledge of personal details left the room chilled. It was as though she carried the memories of the slain herself. Judge Harrison rose. This court will reassess while we investigate. Sheriff Mackenzie will lead the excavation and searches at the sites named by the Morrison girls. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry remain in custody until charges are brought. As the 3 men were shackled and led away, the congregation dispersed slowly, silence hanging heavy in the air. 16 years of carefully woven lies unraveled in a single morning, leaving the people of Pine Hollow to face the unbearable truth that their settlement was founded on bloodshed and deception. Yet for Pastor Phillips, the greatest torment lay not in the crimes themselves, but in the mysteries surrounding the Morrison twins. How could 2 children, barely 9 years old, possess knowledge that shattered every natural law? What did their strange abilities reveal about death? The endurance of the soul, and the possibility that the dead might speak through the living. The twins stood together in the church, their small frames dwarfed by the enormity of the secrets they had revealed. Their pale faces showed exhaustion, weighed down by the agony of channeling so much suffering. "Papa," Rebecca whispered, tugging at her father's sleeve. "Can we go now? The voices are getting louder. It's hard to keep them straight." Ezekiel Morrison drew both girls into his arms, his weathered face etched with worry. "Soon," he promised softly, But first, we must help these people understand what you've shown them. By midday, sunlight fell across the churchyard and the excavation site behind the building. What they uncovered would shake the town forever. The digging took 3 days. Under Judge Harrison's watchful eye, Sheriff Mackenzie's men pried up the church's floorboards and carefully broke through the packed earth below. What they discovered left no room for doubt. The Morrison girls had spoken the truth. 3 skeletons lay beneath the sanctuary, their bones mixed with the foundation stones, exactly as Rebecca described. Among the remains were personal belongings that matched missing persons. Reports from 1818 and 1819. A gold ring engraved J.P. was confirmed to have belonged to Joshua Patterson, a surveyor who had vanished while mapping frontier boundaries. A silver-handled knife matched one owned by William Morse, a merchant whose family had searched in vain for him across 3 states. But the most chilling evidence was tied to the 3rd body. Around its neck hung a copper cross, a piece that Robert Chun's family had described in detail before he disappeared while carrying church donations to Tennessee. The evidence was undeniable. Pine Hollow's history was not one tragic fire, but years of organized murder and theft. Travelers were targeted, slain, and stripped of their belongings. Their blood had bought the lumber, stone, and livelihood of the town. On the 4th day, Judge Harrison, looking older than he had when the ordeal began, addressed the community. "The proof is overwhelming," he declared. Between 1818 and 1820, 11 men were murdered along these trails. Their killers took their money to build this settlement and later killed the Whitman family to keep their secret buried. Before the crowd stood 3 shackled Menelda Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry. Their faces bore the hollow look of men long consumed by guilt. They knew they would not live to see freedom again. "What chills me most," Judge Harrison continued, "is not just the brutality, but the calculation. These men created a system for luring travelers, murdering them, and laundering their blood money into what they called a godly community." Pastor Phillips felt his soul tremble. His ministry, his faith, his very calling, everything had been built on a church soaked in innocent blood. How could he continue here? And then, as they had so many times before, it was the twins who brought the truest perspective. "Judge Harrison," Rebecca said, her voice clear in the hushed crowd. "May we speak of forgiveness?" The judge, who had learned to heed her words after days of impossible revelations, inclined his head. "Yes, child. What is it you wish to say?" Rebecca and Rachel stepped forward beneath the old wooden cross that had silently presided over 16 years of deception. "The Whitman sisters want you all to know they forgive the men who killed them," Rebecca said softly. Rachel added, "They understand fear drives people to terrible acts. But forgiveness doesn't cancel consequences. The guilty must still face justice, and the community must make things right with the families of the dead." Judge Harrison bowed his head. "This court agrees. These men will stand trial for murder and robbery. But what of the community itself? What of this church, these homes, these walls built with stolen lives? Ezekiel Morrison stepped forward. Scripture tells us the sins of the fathers need not be carried by the children, but redemption only comes through confession, restitution, repentance. This community can be cleansed if it chooses truth over comfort. Finally, Pastor Phillips spoke, his voice firm despite the weight in his heart. The church must be rehabilitated. The bones beneath its floor will be given proper burial. We will identify and repay the victims' families as best we can, and we will raise a memorial so these crimes are never hidden again. At this, Solicitor Brennan raised his pen from his papers. The Webb estate alone has grounds for significant restitution, he noted. His surviving brother has already instructed me to pursue compensation for stolen funds and the anguish of 16 years. Buys from his chains. Elder Thompson whispered hoarsely, "The money, it's gone." Elder Thompson, frail and chained, spoke with effort. "The money is gone," he admitted in a weak voice. "It was spent long ago, the town's upkeep, families in need, the church itself. There's nothing left." Judge Harrison's expression hardened. "Then the settlement itself must pay the debt. Every building raised with stolen funds will be sold, and the money given to the victims' kin. Pine Hollow, as a community, will no longer exist." The words landed like a hammer blow. Families who had poured 16 years into building lives here now faced losing their homes, their church, the very heart of their existence. Children would be torn from familiar ground, the elderly left without the place they had hoped to end their days. A whole generation's labor would be erased. But the most chilling words came not from the judge, but from Rebecca Morrison. "Judge Harrison," she said, her young voice unnervingly steady. "There is something else you should know. The crimes did not end in 1820. The church fell into silence. The only sounds were the storm building outside and the creak of old timbers." "What do you mean, child?" the judge asked, his voice tight, as if he already dreaded her reply. Rebecca's twin, Rachel, stepped forward. "The mine shaft where the bodies were hidden isn't only a grave of old sins. People still vanish along these mountain trails." Sheriff Mackenzie sat upright. "Are you saying murders are still happening?" "Not by the same hands," Rebecca explained. "Most of those men are too old now. But others learned what they did, the methods, the hiding places. That knowledge didn't die." Her words rippled through the crowd like ice water. If true, Pine Hollow wasn't just haunted by its past. It had bred a tradition of violence that stretched into the present. Judge Harrison stood abruptly, his face set with grim resolve. "Sheriff, widen the investigation. If there are more victims, they must be found. Every crime tied to this place must be brought to light." As officials moved to act, the Morrison sisters stood together in silence. Their burden was heavy, but their task was complete. For 3 days they had spoken for the dead, revealed hidden truths, and demanded justice no one else dared seek. Their father, Ezekiel Morrison, drew them close. His lined face showed both relief and sorrow. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked, softly. Rebecca's eyes scanned the church one last time. The voices are quieter now, she whispered. Faith and hope can rest. Rachel slipped her hand into her sister's. But, Papa, there will be other voices, other places. Why must we carry all this sorrow? Ezekiel knelt, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know, little ones, but I believe God places heavy burdens only on those strong enough to bear them. Maybe your gift has a purpose greater than we can see. And so the family departed, carrying with them their strange ability and the secrets of Pine Hollow. Pastor Phillips lingered, torn between rebuilding and abandoning the broken settlement. But when he watched the girls walk hand in hand toward their father, he understood. If two children could shoulder such horrors with grace, then perhaps even Pine Hollow had hope for redemption. 3 weeks later, the town was empty. The church was dismantled piece by piece, its lumber sold to help pay restitution. Families scattered across Kentucky and Tennessee, burdened by the knowledge that their community had been built upon blood. Yet whispers spread across the frontier, a story of two young sisters who knew things no living person should, voices of the dead, bearers of justice. Some dismissed it as superstition, others called it divine intervention. Wherever the Morrisons traveled, strange reports followed. Hidden sins revealed, long-forgotten crimes unearthed, communities transformed. Judge Harrison's final report ran 47 pages, chronicling crimes over 2 decades. His closing words echoed through history. This case forces us to reconsider our understanding of truth and justice. Science cannot explain the Morrison children's knowledge, but its accuracy is undeniable. Some truths will not remain buried. Pastor Phillips eventually built a new ministry in Tennessee, dedicated to helping towns face their darkest secrets. But he never forgot those 3 days when 2 9-year-old girls tore open a web of lies and gave voice to the silenced. The mystery of their gift was never solved. Scholars and clergy debated endlessly, but all agreed on one thing. Every fact they revealed was true. Every grave, every crime, every secret they spoke of was verified. The record remains. The truth they carried could not be denied. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story isn't what the children uncovered about the past, but what it implies about justice itself. If those who are murdered cannot truly rest until the truth is revealed, if innocence has the strange power to pierce the veil of death and demand accountability, then maybe moral consequence stretches far beyond this world. The Morrison twins faded from historical records sometime in the 1840s, leaving their ultimate fate unknown. Some accounts suggest they carried on their father's ministry, exposing hidden sins in frontier towns until the end of their days. Others believe they eventually buried their gift, choosing instead to live quietly, far from the places where their names had once been whispered in awe and fear. Yet, in isolated corners of Appalachia, in places where old crimes lie unconfessed, there are still reports of 2 sisters who know things no living soul could know. Witnesses claim they speak of the dead as if they had just shared a conversation. reveal secrets long buried, and confront the guilty with truths they thought were safe in the grave. Are these the same Morrison twins? Their legacy carried on, poor, something far stranger. No one can say for certain. What we do know is that truth, like energy, cannot be destroyed, only changed, only reshaped. Sometimes it finds voices willing to speak for those silenced forever. The Pine Hollow investigation records still rest in the Kentucky State Archives. Judge Harrison's detailed rulings, Sheriff McKenzie's evidence logs, and Pastor Phillips's own journals all confirm the core events. But the greater mystery, the question of how 9-year-old children came to know impossible things, remains unanswered to this day. Some questions seem destined to live in the space between faith and reason, where human understanding falters. So, what do you think? Did the Morrison twins truly serve as messengers for the dead? Or is there a natural explanation science has yet to uncover? The evidence shows their knowledge was real, but its source remains one of history's great enigmas. Drop your theory in the comments below. Do you dare to consider that death may not end consciousness? Or are you convinced there's a rational explanation? Make sure to subscribe for more mysteries that shake our understanding of reality, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Until then, remember, truth has a way of surfacing, and sometimes the smallest voices carry the heaviest truths.